Picture this. It's a cold dawn in November 1096. Somewhere along the muddy roads of Eastern Europe, a young blacksmith named Godwin clutches his meagre possessions: a worn leather satchel, a crude iron knife, and a wooden cross his mother carved for him before he left his village forever. His feet are bleeding through holes in his boots. He hasn't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. The man next to him, a French knight, who once seemed so noble and mighty, is now doubled over with dysentery, his expensive mail hauberk caked with mud and worse. This is not the glorious image of the Crusades you've seen in movies. This is not the romanticized tale of noble knights on a holy quest. This is the truth. This is what it really meant to answer the call to take Jerusalem. And for the next few hours, we're going to walk alongside these forgotten souls, feel the weight of their struggles, and discover the incredible human story that history books often overlook. But here's what will surprise you most. Their reasons for leaving everything behind weren't always what you'd expect. Welcome, dear listener, to a journey unlike any other. Tonight, we're not going to talk about the grand strategies of medieval warfare or the political machinations of popes and emperors. Instead, we're going to do something far more intimate and profound. We're going to step into the worn boots of ordinary people who made an extraordinary choice to leave everything they knew and walk thousands of miles toward an uncertain fate in the Holy Land. The Crusades have been mythologized, romanticized, and dramatized countless times. But what was it really like to be there? Not as a chronicler writing for posterity, not as a lord commanding from horseback, but as one of the tens of thousands of ordinary people who made up the vast majority of every crusading army. What did they eat when food ran out in the middle of nowhere? How did they sleep in the rain? What happened when the disease swept through their camps? How did they maintain their faith when everything went wrong? What did they talk about around their campfires at night? How did they cope with homesickness, fear, and the gradual realization that many of them would never see their families again? These are the questions that keep historians awake at night. Because while we have detailed accounts of battles and political negotiations, the daily human experience of crusading was lived mainly by people who couldn't read or write. Their stories survived only in fragments. A name in a charter, a mention in a letter, an archaeological artifact found centuries later. But by piecing together these fragments with what we know about medieval life, weather patterns, trade routes, and human nature itself, we can reconstruct something remarkable: the lived experience of one of history's most extraordinary mass migrations. So find your most comfortable position, close your eyes, and let your mind travel back over 900 years. Let's walk together along those dusty roads, share those meager meals, and discover the profound humanity at the heart of one of history's most misunderstood movements. But first, let me tell you about the moment that changed everything. A moment that reveals just how different reality was from the legend. November the 27th, 1095. The town of Clermont is in central France. Pope Urban II stands before a crowd that contemporary chroniclers describe as larger than any gathering in living memory. But here's what the history books don't usually tell you. Most of the people listening weren't the noble knights we imagine. They were farmers whose crops had failed for the third year running, younger sons with no inheritance prospects, craftsmen whose trades had been disrupted by local wars, widows with nowhere to turn, people, in other words, who had earthly reasons to listen when someone promised them a new beginning. But let's pause here and really think about what Urban II was asking. He was asking people to leave everything, not just their homes, but their entire world. Medieval people rarely travelled more than a few miles from where they were born. The next village over might speak a different dialect. The next region over might as well have been another planet. And yet they listened. Why? The answer reveals something profound about medieval life that most people today can barely imagine. To understand why hundreds of thousands of people were willing to risk everything for a journey to Jerusalem, we need to understand what daily life was like in the 11th century Europe. Picture Matilda, a farmer's wife in northern France. She wakes before dawn every day to milk the family's single cow. Her breakfast, if she's lucky, is a piece of dark bread so coarse it sometimes breaks her teeth. The bread is made from barley, rye and oats mixed together. Wheat bread is for the wealthy. Her husband works strips of land that belong to their lord. In a good year, after paying their obligations to the Lord and the church, their family has just enough grain to survive the winter. In a bad year, and there had been several bad years recently, they faced starvation. 2 of their children had already died in infancy, victims of diseases that we can easily cure today, but were death sentences then. Matilda has never travelled beyond the local market town. She cannot read or write. Her knowledge of the wider world comes from the priest's sermons and the occasional tales of travelling merchants. When she looks up at the night sky, she sees not a vast universe, but a dome painted by God, with heaven just beyond the stars. Now imagine someone telling Matilda that there's a way to guarantee her soul's salvation, to escape the grinding poverty of her daily existence, and to participate in God's own plan for humanity. All she has to do is walk to Jerusalem. This is the world Urban II was speaking to. Not a world of choice and opportunity, but a world where most people lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, where survival was always uncertain, and where the promise of spiritual reward was the only hope of anything better. But Urban II wasn't just offering spiritual rewards. He was offering something that sounds almost modern: debt forgiveness. The church declared that Crusaders would be protected from their creditors while they were away, for people drowning in debt, which was most people in rural medieval Europe. This was revolutionary. There was more. Crusaders were promised the protection of the church for their families and property while they were gone. In an age when local lords regularly settled disputes through violence, and when a strong man's absence could mean his family's ruin, this protection was invaluable. And then there were the stories of the wealth of the East, of cities where the streets were paved with marble, of lands where spices and silk were as common as wool and barley were in Europe. Were these stories true? That hardly mattered. For people whose lives were circumscribed by poverty and ignorance, the possibility, just the possibility, of something better was enough. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The first people to respond weren't the trained knights and seasoned warriors. Picture Peter the Hermit, a small dark man riding a donkey, dressed in a coarse woolen robe. He's not impressive to look at, but when he speaks, crowds gather. He doesn't talk about military strategy or political goals. He talks about suffering, the suffering of Christians in the Holy Land, the suffering of ordinary people in Europe, and the redemption that awaits those brave enough to take up the cross. Peter's message spreads like wildfire through the villages and towns of northern France and Germany. But the people who respond aren't prepared for what they're undertaking. They're not soldiers. They're not wealthy enough to equip themselves properly. They're just people, desperate, hopeful, faithful people. Among them is a man we know only as Walter the Penniless, a name that tells you everything about his circumstances. There's Emich of Flonheim, a minor German noble whose lands can barely support his pretensions. There are thousands whose names we'll never know, farmers and craftsmen, old women and young children, entire families who sold everything they owned to buy passage toward what they believed would be paradise. They set out in the spring of 1096, months before the official crusading armies were ready to depart. They had no coordinated plan, no supply lines, no fundamental understanding of the distances involved. Some thought Jerusalem was just over the next hill. Others believed they would be fed by divine providence along the way. What's happened to them reveals everything about the gap between crusading ideals and reality. And this is where our journey really begins, not with his knights and banners, but with ordinary people, facing the impossible. Let's be honest about something the medieval chroniclers often glossed over. Not everyone who took the cross was motivated by pure religious devotion. Yes, genuine faith played a crucial role, but human motivations are always complex, and the decision to go on crusade was no exception. Consider young Hugh, the third son of a minor lord in Normandy. Under the laws of primogeniture, his oldest brother will inherit everything. His second brother will likely enter the church. Hugh's options are to serve his older brother as a knight's retainer, living on his generosity, or to seek his fortune elsewhere. The crusade offers a third option, the chance to carve out his own lordship in the east, or consider Anna, a widow whose husband died, leaving her with debts she cannot pay. In medieval society, a woman in her position had few options, all of them grim, but if she takes the cross, her debts are forgiven. Her person is protected by church law, and she gains a chance, however slim, of starting over in a new land. Then there's Brother Marcus, a monk who joined the monastery to escape a violent world, but finds himself increasingly troubled by doubts about his vocation. The crusade offers him a way to serve God that seems more active, more direct than copying manuscripts and singing prayers. None of this diminishes the courage it took to answer the call. If anything, understanding the complex mix of faith, desperation, ambition, and hope that motivated crusaders makes their decision more remarkable, not less. These weren't superhumans driven by pure ideology. They were people like us, facing impossible choices and doing the best they could with limited information and fewer options. But motivation is one thing. Actually preparing for a journey of thousands of miles through unknown territory, that's something else entirely. Imagine trying to organize a camping trip for 100,000 people across multiple countries with no modern transportation, no refrigeration, no weather forecasting, and no reliable maps. Now imagine that some of these people are on foot, others on horseback, some in ox-drawn carts. Imagine that they don't all speak the same language. They're carrying everything they own with them, and they're planning to be away for at least 2 years. This is what crusading leaders faced when they tried to turn Urban II's vision into reality. And the challenges were staggering. Let's start with something basic: food. A single knight needed about 3,500 calories per day. His horse required 20 to 25 pounds of fodder. A foot soldier needed 2,500 calories. A camp follower, the women, children, and non-combatants, who made up a large portion of every crusading army, needed 2,000 calories. Multiply this by tens of thousands of people, and you begin to understand the magnitude of the logistical challenge. A crusading army wasn't just a military force. It was a mobile city, consuming vast quantities of food, water, and supplies every single day. But here's what made it even more complicated. They had to solve these problems using medieval technology and organization. Meet Raymond of Toulouse, one of the most successful crusading leaders. By modern standards, his planning would seem almost comically inadequate. He had no staff officers, no logistics specialists, no detailed maps of the routes he planned to take. What he had was experience from local wars, a rough understanding of geography gained from pilgrims' tales, and an intuitive grasp of what it took to keep an army together. Raymond's preparations began months before departure. He sent messengers ahead to arrange for food supplies in major towns along the route. He negotiated with merchants to provide goods at predetermined stopping points. He arranged for local guides who could navigate particular sections of the journey. But even the best planning had to account for medieval realities. Roads that looked good on parchment might be impassable after heavy rains. Towns that promised supplies might be devastated by local wars by the time the army arrived. Guides might disappear at the first sign of trouble. And then there were the things no one could plan for. Let's walk through a typical Crusader's possessions, because what people carried reveals everything about their expectations and their understanding of what lay ahead. A knight's equipment was extensive and expensive. His primary weapon was the sword, not the elegant rapier of later centuries, but a heavy, broad-bladed instrument designed for cutting through mail armor. He carried a lance for mounted combat, a shield that might weigh 15 pounds, and a hauberk of mail armor that weighed another 30 pounds. But the knight's possessions went far beyond weapons. He needed cooking pots, eating utensils, spare clothing, blankets, tools for maintaining his equipment, feed for his horse, and supplies for his servants. A fully equipped knight's baggage train might include 3 or 4 pack animals just for his personal possessions. A foot soldier travelled much lighter, but his possessions were no less carefully chosen. His primary weapon might be a spear, an axe, or a crossbow. He carried a smaller shield, a mail shirt if he could afford one, and a helmet that might be little more than a reinforced cap. But look at what else he carried. A water container made from leather or wood, a knife for eating and utility work, a fire starter's kit with flint and tinder, a needle and thread for mending clothes, and perhaps a small pot for cooking. Every item had to be balanced against the weight he could carry on a march that might last for months. And then there were the personal items that reveal so much about medieval psychology. A lock of hair from a wife or daughter, a splinter of wood claimed to be from the true cross, a small book of prayers for those who could read, a piece of stone from the local church. These items had no practical value, but they carried immense emotional weight. They were connections to home, to identity, to the faith that motivated the entire enterprise. Here's something that might surprise you. Going on crusade was expensive, ruinously expensive for most people. Historians estimate that equipping a single knight for a crusade cost about 4 times his annual income. For ordinary soldiers, the price was proportionally even higher. This meant that most crusaders had to sell all their possessions just to afford the journey. They sold land, livestock, tools, and household goods. They borrowed money at interest rates that would be considered usurious today. Some literally mortgaged their futures for the chance to reach Jerusalem. But the economic impact went beyond individual finances. Entire regions were disrupted by the sudden need to convert assets into portable wealth. Local markets were flooded with land sales, driving down property values. The price of horses and weapons skyrocketed due to demand. Some clever merchants made fortunes selling crusading supplies. Others were ruined when expected demand failed to materialize. And this economic disruption created unexpected opportunities and unexpected problems that would echo throughout the entire journey. But perhaps the most complex aspect of crusading logistics wasn't material. It was human. How do you organize tens of thousands of people who don't know each other, come from different regions, speak different languages, and have different ideas about authority, discipline, and objectives? Medieval armies solved this problem through what we might call feudal networking. Knights brought their own retainers, who brought their own servants, who brought their own families. Monks travelled with their abbots. Merchants formed their own companies. pilgrims attached themselves to whatever group would have them. The result was not a unified army in the modern sense, but a collection of smaller groups, each with its own internal organization and leadership. A typical crusading force might include a dozen different contingents, each following its own leader, each with its own supplies and objectives. This created both strengths and weaknesses. On the positive side, it made the overall force remarkably resilient. If one contingent was destroyed or separated, the others could continue. It also preserved morale by keeping people with their neighbours and kinsmen. But it also created coordination nightmares. Different contingents marched at various speeds, took different routes, and made different decisions about when to stop, when to fight, and when to negotiate. Some contingents were disciplined and well organized. Others were little more than armed mobs. Despite their thorough planning, Crusaders consistently underestimated certain aspects of their journey. Distance was one. Many thought they could reach Jerusalem in a matter of months. The reality was that the journey took years, assuming you survived it at all. Climate was another. Europeans were unprepared for the heat of the Middle Eastern summer, the intensity of the sun, and the scarcity of water in certain regions. Equipment that worked well in the temperate climates of Northern Europe became liabilities in the desert. But perhaps most significantly, they underestimated the human cost of their undertaking. They planned for battles, but not for the slow attrition of disease, hunger, and exhaustion. They prepared for enemies, but not for the gradual breakdown of morale and discipline that comes with prolonged hardship. And they couldn't prepare for the moments when everything would go wrong at once, when supplies would run out just as winter set in, when guides would abandon them in hostile territory, when political situations would change overnight and turn allies into enemies. These moments of crisis reveal who these people really were. Not the legends, but the flesh and blood human beings facing impossible odds. When most people think of Crusaders, they picture knights in shining armour riding noble destriers. But if you could have stood beside the road in 1096 and watched the crusading armies pass by, you would have seen something very different. You would have seen one of the most diverse mass migrations in medieval history, a human river flowing eastward, carrying people from every level of society and every corner of Europe. Let's meet some of them, not as historical abstractions, but as individuals whose stories illuminate the broader human experience of crusading. Start with Reynold of Broyes, a knight from Champagne whose story survives in fragmentary records. Reynold was not wealthy. His castle was a wooden tower on a small hill. His lands supported perhaps 30 families, and his annual income was modest even by medieval standards. When he decided to take the cross, he had to mortgage his entire estate to pay for his equipment and his journey. Reynold travelled with a group that included his younger brother, 2 cousins, 3 household knights who served him, and about 20 other men-at-arms and servants. He was responsible not just for himself, but for this entire group, their welfare, their supplies, their morale. All of it rested on his shoulders. But here's what makes Reynold interesting. He kept a journal, not a formal chronicle, but practical record of expenses, distances travelled, and lessons learned. From his notes, we get glimpses of the daily reality of crusading. Lost 2 horses to colic near Nicaea. Brother Guillaume is sick with a fever. Paid 30 solidi for barely enough grain to last a week. Reynold's concerns weren't strategic or theological. They were immediate and practical. Finding fodder for the horses, treating sick comrades, managing increasingly limited resources. His journal reveals a man trying to hold his small world together as everything familiar slipped away behind him. Or consider Bohemond of Taranto, one of the more famous crusading leaders. Even he with his wealth and reputation, faced constant challenges that had nothing to do with military glory. His correspondence reveals a man perpetually worried about money, about supplies, about keeping his followers motivated during long periods of inactivity. In one letter, Bohemond writes about having to sell his personal silverware to buy food for his army. In another, he describes having to arbitrate disputes between different factions within his own forces. These are not the concerns of a legendary hero, but of a medieval CEO trying to manage a complex organization under impossible circumstances. But the knights, vital as they were, made up only a small fraction of the crusading armies. The majority were ordinary soldiers, men like Godric the carpenter, whose story comes to us through legal documents from his home village in England. Godric was a skilled craftsman, respected in his community, with a wife and 3 children. He owned his own tools, a small house, and a workshop. By the standards of his time and place, he was successful. So why did he abandon everything to go on crusade? The answer, preserved in a lawsuit filed years later, reveals the complexity of crusading motivation. Godric's oldest son had been killed in a hunting accident. His wife had died in childbirth, along with what would have been their 4th child. His business was failing because a new lord had imposed heavy taxes on craftsmen. Godric was a man whose world had collapsed, and the crusade offered him something that nothing else could, a chance to start over, and a framework of religious meaning to make sense of his losses. Godric sold his workshop to pay for his crusading equipment, a spear, a leather jerkin reinforced with metal rings, a Spartan helmet, and supplies for the journey. He left his surviving children with his brother and set off for Jerusalem, carrying everything he owned in a single pack. We know from other records that Godric never returned home. His name appears on a list of Crusaders who died during the siege of Antioch. But before his death, he'd written one letter that was carried back to England by a returning pilgrim. In it, he described the beauty of the Byzantine churches, the strangeness of foreign food, and the profound sense of purpose he felt in serving God's cause. "I'm happier now," he wrote, "than I have been since Margaret died." But perhaps the most surprising group of crusaders were the ones we rarely hear about in traditional histories. Here's something that might shock you. Women made up a substantial portion of every crusading army. Not just the wives of nobles travelling in comfort, but working women, widows, and even independent female entrepreneurs who saw opportunity in the expedition to the Holy Land. Meet Marguerite of Flanders, a textile merchant who joined the First Crusade not as anyone's wife or daughter, but as an independent businesswoman. Marguerite had identified a market opportunity. Crusading armies needed constant supplies of cloth for everything from bandages to tent repairs, and they were often far from traditional supply sources. Marguerite travelled with her own wagon, loaded with bolts of wool and linen, needles and thread, and finished garments. She employed 4 seamstresses and 2 male servants to help manage her mobile business. Along the crusading route, she sold to individual soldiers and negotiated bulk contracts with army commanders. But Marguerite's role went beyond commerce. Her skills as a seamstress made her invaluable for treating wounds. Medieval medical practice relied heavily on textile skills for everything from bandaging to surgical procedures. Her business contacts made her an informal intelligence source, as merchants often had the best information about road conditions, political situations, and supply availability. From surviving business records, we know that Marguerite made a considerable profit from her crusading venture, but we also know that she used much of that profit to fund a hospital for wounded crusaders in Antioch. Her story illustrates how practical and spiritual motivations could intertwine in complex ways. Or consider the story of women like Agnes the midwife, whose skills were desperately needed in armies where women continued to give birth. Men suffered injuries that required delicate care, and knowledge of herbal medicine could mean the difference between life and death. Agnes travelled with a group of families from her home region in Normandy. She carried not weapons, but a different kind of essential equipment: surgical knives, medicinal herbs, clean cloths for bandaging, and the knowledge passed down through generations of women who had served as unofficial medical practitioners in their communities. Agnes delivered babies in ox carts during river crossings. She treated infected wounds by candlelight in makeshift camps. She prepared bodies for burial when her skills weren't enough to save lives. Her journal, one of the few surviving first-person accounts by a female crusader, provides a unique perspective on the human cost of the expedition. "Today, I buried young Henri, son of the blacksmith from Caen," she writes. "Fever took him despite all my herbs. His mother weeps and asks why God would call her boy home when he was serving the holy cause. I have no answer for her, but I hold her while she grieves. The children, the forgotten participants, perhaps most poignantly, crusading armies included thousands of children, not just the teenage sons of nobles seeking their fortunes, but young children travelling with their families, orphans who had attached themselves to crusading groups, and adolescents who saw the expedition as their chance for adventure and advancement. Consider 12-year-old Thomas, son of a minor English lord. Thomas was too young to be an effective fighter, but too old to be left behind when his father decided to take the cross. His role in the crusading army was essentially that of a page, caring for equipment, tending horses, running messages between different parts of the military. But Thomas's letters home, dictated to a scribe, reveal a child trying to make sense of experiences far beyond his years. He describes the excitement of seeing Constantinople for the first time, the terror of his first battle, and the grief of losing friends to disease. His childish wonder at foreign customs alternates with mature observations about human nature under stress. "The Greek soldiers wear different armour than ours," he writes in one letter. "Their food tastes strange, but some of it is good. Father says we must not trust them, but they have been kind to me. I think people are much the same everywhere, only they speak different words." Thomas survived the crusade and returned home, eventually inheriting his father's lands. But his experiences shaped him profoundly. Later records show him founding a school and a hospital, and his will mentions substantial donations to support pilgrims travelling to the Holy Land, suggesting that his crusading experience left him with a lasting sense of obligation to other travellers. But children like Thomas were among the lucky ones. The reality of daily life on the march was harsh even for adults. One of the most fascinating aspects of the crusading armies was how they attracted entrepreneurs, people who saw economic opportunity in the massive logistical challenge of moving tens of thousands of people across thousands of miles. Take Master William the Cook, a man who had operated a small inn in northern France before joining the First Crusade. William didn't come as a soldier, but as a service provider. He brought with him a portable kitchen, iron pots of various sizes, cooking utensils, spices and preservatives, and the knowledge of how to prepare edible meals from whatever ingredients might be available. William's customers were primarily knights and wealthy pilgrims who could afford to pay for better food than the standard army rations. But his services went beyond cooking. He knew how to preserve meat during long marches, how to identify safe water sources, and how to forage for edible plants in unfamiliar territories. More importantly, William's kitchen became a social centre. Nobles who might never have spoken to each other at home found themselves sharing meals and conversation around William's cooking fires. His establishment became an informal place for exchanging information, negotiating alliances, and maintaining the social bonds that held the army together. William's business thrived during the Crusade, but his success came at a cost. He lost 2 of his assistants to disease, spent months of his own profits buying food for starving pilgrims, and eventually donated most of his equipment to establish a permanent kitchen for a Crusader hospital in Jerusalem. The spiritual leadership of the crusading armies faced unique challenges. They were responsible not just for conducting religious services, but for maintaining morale during periods of extreme hardship, providing comfort to the dying, and somehow reconciling the violence of warfare with Christian teaching. Father Benedict, a monk from Cluny who joined the First Crusade, left behind a remarkable record of his struggles with these contradictions. His letters to his abbot reveal a man torn between his monastic vows of peace and his duty to support the holy war. "How do I bless weapons meant to kill?" he writes. "How do I comfort a dying man who has just finished slaughtering his enemies? How do I reconcile the teachings of Christ with the necessities of our cause?" Benedict's solution was to focus on the pastoral aspects of his role. He spent most of his time caring for the sick, comforting the bereaved, and trying to maintain some semblance of Christian community among people living under extreme stress. His journal describes conducting funeral services by moonlight, hearing confessions in multiple languages, and celebrating Christmas Mass in a snow-covered tent. But Benedict also served practical functions that had nothing to do with religion. He was one of the few people in the army who could read and write in multiple languages, making him valuable for diplomatic communications. His theological training included knowledge of medicine, making him a valuable healthcare provider. His moral authority gave him influence in settling disputes that might otherwise have led to violence within the army. These diverse individuals, knights and commoners, merchants and monks, men and women and children, somehow had to function as a community while facing challenges that would test any modern organization. The most remarkable aspect of the crusading armies was how this diverse collection of individuals managed to function as a coherent force. They came from different regions, spoke different languages, followed different customs, and had different expectations about everything from military discipline to personal hygiene. Yet somehow they developed shared routines, common goals, and mutual dependencies that allowed them to survive challenges that would have destroyed a less cohesive group. The process wasn't smooth. The historical record is full of disputes, desertions, and internal conflicts, but the overall achievement was remarkable. Part of the solution was practical. People with complementary skills naturally gravitated toward each other. Knights needed servants, merchants, guards, and craftsmen. Customers were required. These practical relationships created networks of mutual obligation that helped hold the community together. Part of the solution was cultural. Shared religious beliefs provided a common framework for understanding their mission and their sacrifices. Daily religious observances created shared rhythms that helped integrate diverse groups into a larger whole. And part of the solution was simply human. Faced with common dangers and hardships, people who might have been enemies at home became allies on the road. The crusading armies developed their own culture, their own traditions, and their own sense of identity that transcended regional and class boundaries. But creating community was one thing. Sustaining it during the grinding realities of daily life on the march, that was something else entirely. The day begins before sunrise. not because of any military regulation, but because of necessity. In a camp of 50,000 people, everything takes longer than you might imagine. Getting water, preparing food, breaking camp, organising the march. These simple tasks become massive logistical operations when multiplied by the size of a crusading army. Picture the scene. It's October 1097, somewhere in Anatolia. The air is cold enough to see your breath, but it will be hot enough to roast by midday. The camp stretches as far as you can see in the dim pre-dawn light. Thousands of tents, lean-tos made from cloaks and spears, and simple bedrolls under the open sky. The first people awake are the guards, of course, but close behind them are the camp followers tasked with preparing food. Fires are stirred back to life from carefully banked coals. Starting a fire from scratch wastes precious time and resources. Water is fetched from whatever source is available. A stream if they're lucky, wells if they're camped near a town, or carefully rationed supplies from water barrels if they're crossing dry country. The smell of cooking food mingles with less pleasant odours. 50,000 people living in close quarters without modern sanitation create smells that would be overwhelming to modern noses. But these people are accustomed to it. Medieval standards of cleanliness were very different from ours, and Crusaders had to adapt to even more primitive conditions than they knew at home. Let's talk about food, because nothing shaped the crusading experience more than the constant challenge of feeding so many people. A crusading army consumed enormous quantities of food every day, but unlike a modern military, they had no supply lines, no quartermaster corps, and no reliable way to preserve food for long periods. The basic diet was simple: bread, cheese, and whatever meat was available. But simple doesn't mean easy to provide. Bread required grain, which had to be purchased or requisitioned from local sources. It also needed mills to grind the grain and ovens to bake the bread. A crusading army typically travelled with several mobile mills, essentially large grinding stones that could be set up wherever the army camped. But even with mobile mills, bread making was a complex operation. The grain had to be purchased or seized, transported to the mills, ground into flour, mixed with water and salt to make dough, and then baked in temporary ovens constructed at each camp. The entire process took most of a day and required the coordinated effort of hundreds of people. And that was when everything went right, when grain was scarce, when mills broke down, when fuel for fires was unavailable, or when the army was moving too quickly to allow for proper bread making. People went hungry. But hunger was just the beginning of their food challenges. The real problems came when they encountered foods they'd never seen before. As the Crusaders moved east, they encountered foods that were utterly foreign to European palates. Rice was unknown in most of Europe, but it was a staple in many of the regions they passed through. Spices that are common today, cinnamon, pepper, ginger, were exotic luxuries that most Crusaders had never tasted. Some Crusaders adapted to local foods. Others became sick from eating unfamiliar ingredients. There are records of entire groups suffering from digestive problems after eating local fruits or vegetables that their systems couldn't handle. One chronicler describes a group of Frankish knights who became violently ill after eating what they thought was familiar bread, not realizing it had been made with a type of grain that Europeans typically fed only to animals. Water was an even bigger challenge than food. Europeans were accustomed to the relatively abundant rainfall and numerous streams of their home regions. In the drier climates of Anatolia and Syria, water sources were scarce and had to be shared with local populations who were not always friendly. Crusaders learned to judge water quality by methods that were crude but sometimes effective. Clear, flowing water was generally safe. Still water, especially if it had an odd colour or smell, was avoided when possible. But when people were desperately thirsty, they drank whatever was available and suffered the consequences. Shelter was another daily challenge that modern people can barely imagine. The wealthy Crusaders travelled with substantial tents, elaborate affairs with multiple rooms, furniture, and even carpets. But these were a tiny minority. Most Crusaders slept under much simpler arrangements. A typical knight might have a small tent that he shared with his servants and men-at-arms. Ordinary soldiers often slept under lean-tos made from cloaks, blankets, and spears. The poorest pilgrims slept in the open, using their packs as pillows and their cloaks as blankets. But even having shelter didn't guarantee comfort. Medieval tents were not waterproof by modern standards. When it rained, everyone got wet. When it was cold, people huddled together for warmth. When it was hot, the tents became stifling ovens that were almost unbearable during the day. Sleep itself was a challenge. Medieval people were accustomed to sleeping when it got dark and waking at dawn, but crusading armies often had to adjust their schedules based on military necessities. Sometimes they marched at night to avoid the heat of the day. Sometimes they had to stay awake all night because of the threat of enemy attack. And then there were the minor discomforts that accumulated over time. Lice were a constant problem. Almost everyone had them, and there was no practical way to get rid of them. Fleas, ticks, and other parasites were common. Skin diseases, rashes, and infections were endemic in camps where personal hygiene was minimal and medical knowledge was limited. But perhaps nothing tested the Crusaders more than the weather, and their complete inability to predict or prepare for it. Medieval people had no weather forecasting, no understanding of climate patterns, and no reliable way to prepare for seasonal changes in regions they'd never visited. Crusaders from Northern Europe were entirely unprepared for the extremes of Middle Eastern weather. The heat was devastating. European knights who were accustomed to the temperate climates of France or Germany found themselves marching across Anatolian deserts in full armour during summer temperatures that reached well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Many died of heat stroke. Others abandoned their heavy equipment rather than carry it in the blazing sun. But cold could be equally deadly. The winter of 1097 to 1098, during the siege of Antioch, was exceptionally harsh. Crusaders who had survived the heat of the previous summer found themselves facing freezing temperatures, snow, and ice storms for which they were utterly unprepared. Contemporary accounts describe people burning furniture, books, and even wooden parts of their equipment to stay warm. Horses and pack animals died in large numbers, leaving the army without transportation for supplies and equipment. Some Crusaders resorted to eating their leather belts and shoes, not because of starvation, but because the leather had frozen solid and had to be boiled to be made edible. Rain created different but equally serious problems. Medieval roads were not paved, and heavy rain turned them into rivers of mud. Ox carts became stuck and had to be abandoned. Horsemen found themselves dismounted and leading their animals through knee-deep mire. Equipment was lost, supplies were ruined, and people became sick from constant exposure to cold, wet conditions. One of the most detailed accounts of weather-related suffering comes from the anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum, who describes the winter siege of Antioch. The rain fell without ceasing for days on end. Our tents offered no protection. The water ran through them as if they were made of straw. Our clothes were never dry. Our food spoiled. Our horses stood in mud up to their bellies, and many sickened and died. Men who had been strong warriors became weak as children, shivering and coughing and unable to hold their weapons steady. But weather was only one of the environmental challenges that Crusaders faced. Disease was far more deadly than enemy action, and medieval medical knowledge was almost completely inadequate for dealing with the health problems created by large numbers of people living in unsanitary conditions. Dysentery was probably the biggest killer. It spread rapidly through camps where human waste contaminated water supplies. Once someone contracted dysentery, they became dehydrated and weak, making them susceptible to other diseases. There was no effective treatment. Medieval doctors understood nothing about bacteria or the importance of sanitation. Typhus, spread by lice, was another major killer. Since almost everyone had lice, and people lived in close quarters, typhus could sweep through an army with devastating speed. The disease caused high fevers, severe headaches, and often death within a few days. Malaria was common in areas with standing water. Scurvy affected armies that went long periods without fresh fruits and vegetables. Various respiratory infections thrived in camps where people were crowded together, weakened by poor nutrition and exposed to harsh weather. Medieval medical treatment was often worse than no treatment at all. Bloodletting was a common remedy for almost any illness, but it weakened patients who were already sick. Herbal remedies were sometimes helpful, but just as often they were useless or even harmful. Yet somehow, in the midst of all this hardship, people found ways to maintain relationships, fall in love, create friendships, and build the social bonds that made survival possible. The social life of the march. Despite all the hardships, or perhaps because of them, crusading armies developed rich social lives. People thrown together under extreme circumstances often formed bonds that would be impossible under normal conditions. Class distinctions that seemed absolute in Europe became more fluid on the crusading march. Evening gatherings around cooking fires became informal social centres. Stories were told, songs were sung, and news was exchanged. A knight might find himself sharing a meal with a common soldier, a merchant, and a monk, a social mixing that would have been unthinkable at home. Romance flourished, despite the harsh conditions. Marriages were arranged and celebrated with whatever ceremony was possible under the circumstances. Children were born during the march and baptized by travelling priests in makeshift chapels. These life events helped maintain a sense of normalcy and continuity despite the extraordinary circumstances. But relationships were also tested by the stress of the journey. Friendships that had lasted for years could be destroyed by arguments over food or water. Marriages broke down under the pressure of constant hardship. Some people discovered reserves of courage and generosity they never knew they had. Others revealed themselves to be selfish or cowardly when tested. Gambling was popular despite being officially discouraged by church authorities. Dice games, betting on various outcomes, and other forms of gaming provided entertainment and a way to pass time during long periods of inactivity. The stakes were usually small: a piece of bread, a cup of wine, or a few coins. But the games served critical social functions by creating interaction and friendly competition. Music and storytelling were vital for maintaining morale. Professional entertainers, minstrels, storytellers, and musicians were valuable members of crusading communities. But music wasn't limited to professionals. People sang while they worked, marched, and sat around fires in the evening. Songs from home helped maintain connections to the world they had left behind, while new songs celebrated their adventures and commemorated their fallen comrades. Over time, crusading armies developed daily rhythms that helped create order out of chaos. These weren't formally mandated schedules, but patterns that emerged naturally from the needs of such large groups of people. The day typically began before dawn with religious observances. Morning prayers provided a shared activity that helped unite diverse groups around common purposes. The prayers also served practical functions. They gave people time to fully wake up and prepare for the day's activities. They provided an opportunity for leaders to communicate with their followers. Breaking camp was a complex operation that required coordination among many different groups. Tents had to be struck, equipment packed, animals loaded, and formations organized. A large crusading army might take several hours to complete these preparations, which meant that the vanguard could be miles down the road before the rearguard had even left the previous night's campsite. The march itself was not a single column, but a series of separate groups, each moving at its own pace. Knights on horseback could travel much faster than foot soldiers or ox carts, so they often ranged ahead to scout the route or secure the next campsite. Merchants and camp followers typically brought up the rear, travelling more slowly but carrying essential supplies. Rest stops were determined by practical necessities, the availability of water, the condition of the weakest travellers, and the security situation. During these stops, people attended to personal needs, checked their equipment, and shared information about road conditions ahead. But it was in the evening, when the day's march was done, that the real life of the crusading community emerged. As the sun set and the day's march ended, the crusading army transformed from a travelling caravan into a temporary city. Campsites were chosen based on the availability of water, defensibility, and space for the thousands of people and animals that made up the army. The evening meal was the social highlight of the day. Families and groups gathered around their fires to share whatever food they had managed to acquire. The wealthy might feast on meat, wine, and bread, while the poor made do with porridge and water. But regardless of the quality of the food, these shared meals were essential for maintaining group cohesion and morale. After eating, people attended to the countless small tasks that kept them alive and functional. Clothes were mended, equipment was maintained, animals were cared for, and plans were made for the next day's journey. These activities were often done communally, with people sharing tools, skills, and materials. Evening prayers provided another opportunity for communal activity. Different groups held their own services, but the sound of singing and chanting from throughout the camp created a sense of shared purpose and mutual support. As full darkness fell, most people settled down to sleep, but even then, the camp remained active. Guards walked their posts, animals were tended, and sick people were cared for. The night sounds of a crusading camp, snoring, coughing, quiet conversations, the movement of animals, created a constant background of human presence that was both comforting and exhausting. This daily rhythm, wake, pray, march, rest, eat, sleep, provided structure and predictability in lives that had been completely disrupted by the decision to go on crusade. It wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't easy, but it was sustainable. People could endure extraordinary hardships as long as they had routines to follow and communities to belong to. But even the best routines and strongest communities could be tested beyond their limits. And for the Crusaders, those tests were about to become more severe than anything they had yet experienced. It was during the winter siege of Antioch in the early months of 1098 that the crusading army faced its most significant test. Not from enemy action, though the Muslim defenders fought fiercely, but from something far more basic and inexorable: starvation. By January, the carefully planned supply system had completely broken down. The army had been camped outside Antioch for months, far longer than anyone had anticipated. Local food sources had been exhausted. Supply convoys from Byzantine territory were few and unreliable. The Mediterranean trade routes that might have brought relief were controlled by hostile forces. What happened next reveals the dark side of the crusading experience, the side that medieval chroniclers often glossed over because it didn't fit the heroic narrative they wanted to tell. People began to starve. Not the dramatic, noble starvation of epic poems, but the slow, grinding, humiliating process of watching your body consume itself. First, the non-essential supplies were eaten: leather belts, shoes, and saddles. Then the pack animals were slaughtered, even though this made future travel almost impossible. Then people began to die. The anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum describes scenes that are almost too grim to contemplate. Men who had been strong and proud were reduced to searching through horse dung for undigested grains of barley. Nobles who had owned vast estates begged for scraps of bread from their own servants. Mothers watched their children grow thin and weak, knowing they had nothing to feed them. But the most heartbreaking accounts come from the letters that some crusaders managed to send home during this period. These letters, preserved in monastic archives, provide an unfiltered view of human suffering that the official chronicles tried to minimize. Consider this letter from a knight named Stephen of Blois to his wife Adela, written in March 1098. My beloved wife, I write to you from outside the walls of Antioch, where we have been camped for many months. I must tell you honestly that our situation is desperate. Many of our companions have died, not from battle wounds, but from hunger and disease. The horses are nearly all dead, and we who once rode proudly now walk like ordinary foot soldiers. Yesterday I saw Lord Raymond's own cook fighting with a servant over a piece of mouldy bread. Men who once feasted on venison and wine now consider themselves fortunate to find a handful of grain. I have sold my second sword to buy food, but we're still hungry. I do not write this to worry you, so that you will understand why some of us speak of returning home. This is not the glorious adventure we expected. It is a test of endurance that grows harder each day. Stephen never sent this letter. It was found among his possessions after his death, but its honest assessment of conditions reveals how different the reality of crusading was from the expectations that had motivated so many people to take the cross. And Stephen wasn't alone in his doubts. As conditions worsened, the unthinkable began to happen. Desertion had been a problem from the beginning of the crusading expedition. Medieval armies always lost people along the way, some to death, some to injury, some to simple changes of heart. But during the winter of 1097 to 1098, desertion became an epidemic that threatened to destroy the entire enterprise. The most shocking desertion was that of Stephen of Blois himself, one of the expedition's most prominent leaders. Stephen slipped away from the army in the middle of the night, taking with him not just his own retinue, but also several other noble families who had lost faith in the mission. Stephen's desertion was shocking not just because of his prominence, but because of what it represented. If a wealthy, powerful noble who had invested enormous resources in the expedition could abandon it, what hope was there for ordinary soldiers who had far less to lose? But Stephen's desertion was just the most visible example of a much broader phenomenon. Every day, individuals and small groups slipped away from the army. Some headed back towards Europe, hoping to make it home before their resources ran out. Others sought refuge in local communities, abandoning their crusading vows in favor of immediate survival. The psychological impact of this mass desertion was devastating. Those who remained began to question their own commitment. If so many others were giving up, were they fools to continue? Were they throwing their lives away for a cause that was clearly hopeless? As conditions worsened and desertion increased, the military discipline that had held the crusading armies together began to break down. Hungry, demoralized people are not good soldiers, and the crusading leaders found it increasingly difficult to maintain order. Theft became common as people competed for scarce resources. Men who had fought together as comrades began to steal food from each other. Equipment disappeared from unguarded tents. Even religious items, crosses, relics, and sacred vessels, were stolen and sold for food. Violence within the camps increased. Arguments over food, water, or shelter escalated into fights that sometimes ended in death. Different national groups, French, German, Italian, Norman, began to blame each other for their everyday problems. What had once been a unified Christian army began to fragment along ethnic and regional lines. The leadership struggled to maintain authority under these conditions. Traditional punishments like fines or imprisonment were meaningless to people who had nothing to lose. Physical punishment was counterproductive when the army needed every able-bodied person it could keep. Some leaders resorted to increasingly harsh measures to maintain discipline, which only increased resentment and the desire to desert. But perhaps the most dangerous breakdown was not in military discipline, but in the social bonds that had held these diverse communities together. The social structures that had developed during the early months of crusading began to crumble under the pressure of extreme hardship. Relationships that had seemed strong proved fragile when tested by starvation and desperation. Class distinctions, which had been temporarily softened by the shared experience of crusading, reasserted themselves with a vengeance. Wealthy crusaders hoarded food while ordinary soldiers starved. Nobles, who had seemed approachable and egalitarian during the good times, became aloof and protective of their privileges when resources became scarce. But the breakdown wasn't just between social classes. Families turned on each other. Husbands abandoned wives who had become too weak to travel. Parents made the agonizing decision to leave behind children who were slowing down their groups. Friends who had supported each other through months of hardship began to compete for survival. The most heartbreaking accounts describe the dissolution of the informal adoption networks that had developed during the march. Orphaned children who had been cared for by unrelated adults were abandoned when those adults could no longer feed them. Elderly people who had been supported by their communities were left behind when those communities could no longer bear the burden. The mental health effects of prolonged starvation and stress were severe, though medieval people had no framework for understanding them. What we would recognize as depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress was simply accepted as part of the human condition. Many crusaders experienced what contemporary sources describe as melancholia, a deep sadness and loss of hope that made it difficult for them to function. Some became obsessed with death, spending hours preparing for what they saw as their inevitable demise. Others became recklessly aggressive, seeking death in battle rather than waiting for it to come through starvation or disease. Religious faith, which had sustained many crusaders through the early difficulties, began to waver under the extreme stress. If God supported their cause, why were they suffering so terribly? If they were doing God's work, why did they feel abandoned and forgotten? Some people responded to these doubts by becoming more intensely religious, interpreting their suffering as a test of faith that would ultimately lead to greater rewards. Others became cynical and bitter, concluding that the entire crusading enterprise was a mistake or even a fraud perpetrated by ambitious leaders. Sleep disorders were common. People who were exhausted by physical hardship found it difficult to sleep because of anxiety about the future. Nightmares were frequent, often involving themes of death, abandonment, and failure. The The constant stress created a state of hypervigilance that made it difficult for people to relax even when conditions allowed for rest. But just when it seemed that the crusading army might disintegrate completely, something unexpected happened. What saved the crusading army from complete collapse was not military genius or divine intervention, but something more mundane and more remarkable: human resilience and adaptability. People found ways to survive that no one had anticipated. They developed new methods of finding and preparing food. They created new forms of social organization adapted to their desperate circumstances. They discovered reserves of strength and cooperation that they didn't know they possessed. The most successful adaptations came from the bottom up, not from the official leadership. Ordinary soldiers and camp followers, who had the most experience with hardship, developed practical solutions that kept people alive. They learned to identify edible plants that were unknown in Europe. They figured out how to catch and prepare small animals that knights would never have considered food. They invented new ways to preserve and share scarce resources. Women played a vital role in these survival innovations. Their traditional responsibilities for food preparation and household management translated into valuable skills for keeping communities alive under extreme conditions. Women, who had been marginal figures in the military hierarchy, became central to the army's survival. While many relationships broke down under the pressure of extreme hardship, others were strengthened. The people who survived the worst periods of the siege often formed bonds that lasted for the rest of their lives. Shared suffering created a sense of mutual obligation and understanding that was deeper than ordinary friendship. Some of the most moving accounts from this period describe small acts of generosity and sacrifice. A knight sharing his last piece of bread with a dying servant. A merchant uses his remaining coins to buy medicine for a stranger's child. A group of soldiers carried a wounded comrade for hundreds of miles rather than abandoning him. These acts of compassion weren't universal, and they didn't solve the larger problems facing the army. But they provided examples of human decency that helped maintain hope during the darkest periods. They reminded people that they were part of a community that was worth preserving, even at significant personal cost. Religious observances, rather than declining during the period of most extraordinary hardship, actually became more important to many people. Shared prayers and religious rituals provided structure and meaning during periods when normal social organization had broken down. They also created opportunities for people to express their hopes and fears in a communal setting. The daily rhythm of religious observance, morning prayers, evening services, grace before meals, provided continuity and predictability in lives that had been completely disrupted. Even when people had doubts about their faith, the familiar routines of religious practice offered comfort and stability. And gradually, as winter turned to spring, the situation began to improve. But the scars from this period of extreme hardship would affect the crusading armies for the rest of their journey. The winter of 1097 to 1098 changed the character of the crusading armies permanently. The people who survived it were more complex, more practical, and more realistic about the challenges they faced. They had fewer illusions about the glory of their enterprise, but they also had a deeper understanding of their own capabilities. The leadership structure of the armies was also transformed. Leaders who had shown weakness or incompetence during the crisis lost their authority, regardless of their noble birth or financial resources. New leaders emerged from unexpected places, people who had demonstrated practical skills and personal courage during the worst times. The social hierarchy of the armies became more fluid and merit-based. People who had proven their worth during the crisis gained respect and influence that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Conversely, people who had failed the test of extreme hardship found their status diminished. Perhaps most importantly, the armies developed a collective memory of survival that helped them face subsequent challenges. They had proof that they could endure terrible hardship and emerge intact. This knowledge gave them the confidence to continue their journey, even when faced with new obstacles.